Story number 1. I'm obsessed with online gaming, specifically Grand Theft Auto 5, which came out a while ago, but I only started getting into recently. I didn't care for the single-player story, I only liked playing online. Now, I should probably mention that I'm a girl. One of the reasons I love GTA 5 so much is because I don't really encounter a lot of people who actually care about the fact that I'm a girl. It doesn't matter. I've met one or two guys who ask crude questions or make sick jokes, but that's about it. I don't go around telling people that I'm a girl. However, my gamer name makes it pretty obvious that I am. I won't tell you what it is, for obvious reasons. Let's just say that it has the word princess in it. Anyway, back to the story. I've never met a creep that I can't handle, but one winter morning I had the scariest experience of my life. It had snowed during the night, and with the right amount of snowfall covering the roads and black ice making commuting dangerous, school was canceled. Instead of rushing out to play in the snow, I hopped onto my console and started up my game. Most of the day went by without a hitch, until one guy on the server happened to notice that I was a girl. I think I had just stolen some of his business's product, which is something you can do in the game, and he was pretty upset. I can't even repeat the slurs and insults that flooded the chat. I've dealt with the same thing before. It wasn't long before the insults became actual threats. He started saying things like how he would kill me and my whole family. He said he would burn my house to the ground. The threats got more violent. I did my best to ignore the guy, and I probably should have just kept doing that. When he said he was going to burn my house to the ground, I got a little too confident. I responded, "How? You don't even know where I live." He went quiet after that, and I felt pretty good about myself, for a full 5 seconds. After that, I saw something appear in the chat that scared the hell out of me. My skin turned pale and goosebumps covered my skin. The guy went quiet for only a moment, and when he came back, he typed my address into the chat. He knew where I lived. I'm still not sure how he found out what my address was. My fight or flight response kicked in, and I shut off the console. Not only that, I pulled the plug completely. I contacted the game's support. I was told that the guy got banned, and that was the end of it. Thankfully, no one ever showed up to the house, and nothing came of that creep's threats. I still play GTA 5 online, but I rarely ever speak in the chat. You never know who you're talking to or what they're capable of. Story number 2. I usually don't like talking in online games. I'm kind of an introvert, and while I like playing online games with other people, I'm really shy and I very rarely actually talk to them. This is difficult because I play a lot of shooters which require you to communicate with your teammates. I still have game chat on though, so I can hear my teammates make callouts, but my microphone is on push to talk. That way they can't hear me. I managed to get away with using the game's pinging system to communicate. My main game at the time of this story was Fortnite. I know what you're going to say. Not too long ago, I got loaded into a squad. 2 of the guys sounded around my age, which was mid-teens, but the third one sounded like a really young kid. He was really loud and obnoxious, but I found it kind of adorable. He seemed really impressed by my skill and was constantly complimenting me. I won't lie, I loved it. Anyway, we were doing pretty well, but we ultimately lost the game. Now, usually I'd just load into the next random squad. However, the kid sent me a friend request and I did really enjoy playing with him, so I accepted and went on to play several more games with him. He was very talkative and didn't really mind that I wasn't. It was the best time I'd had on the game in a while. About 6 games in, I heard a strange sound through his microphone. It was like a loud, sudden bang followed by the kid's gasp. Then there was silence. I had no idea what was happening, but his character in the game had stopped moving in the middle of nowhere and he had gone silent for the first time since we started playing. I was already worried that something bad had happened. I built around him in the game and just chilled for a bit, thinking that he'd just gone AFK for a bit. He did come back, but he sounded really different. He was crying and I could barely understand what he was saying. I knew that he was in trouble and he was asking for my help. This was the first time I'd ever thought about using my microphone, but I had no other choice. I started asking him questions and eventually learned that his dad was drunk, which sounded like a common occurrence, but he said his dad was really angry. It was so horrifying hearing this little kid explain, in tears, how terrified he was of his own father. I went on to tell the kid to lock his door and be really quiet. When I told him to call the cops, he said his mom told him he was too young for a phone. I was playing on European servers and he sounded British. I happened to live in Russia at the time. I asked him to tell me his address while I dialed the British police myself. I kept talking to him, comforting him, while explaining the situation to the police. It was the most terrifying experience I'd ever been through, so I can't even imagine how that poor little kid was feeling. I'll cut the story short. The police did get to his house in time. The kid didn't come online for a while after that, and I was a little worried. One day I saw him online and instantly loaded into the game. It was such a relief to hear that he was okay and that he and his mom were living in a new house, far away from his father. We still play Fortnite every now and again. Even as we both move on to other games and life gets busy, we still manage to log on and enjoy a few games together. He's the only person that I talk to in online games, and I'm really grateful to have him in my life. Story number 3. I've been into gaming since I was a little kid. It started as early as Mario on the Nintendo. Once I got older, it wasn't long until I got into PC gaming and Steam. Back then, there weren't a lot of high-end games like there is today. Still, my computer could barely run games like Half-Life, and there was no hope in me being able to play something like Crysis. Due to this, my main games were Team Fortress 2 and almost all the Quakes. Now, Quake was cool, but there's something different about playing an online game. I don't think the online version of Quake was out yet, or I just didn't care about it. So I mostly played TF2 for that social interaction. TF2 isn't exactly known for its community. There are a lot of jerks, weirdos, and creeps playing that game. Basically, ignoring the in-game chat box was the easiest way to actually enjoy the game. This one match I played is burned into my mind, and I haven't touched the game since. We had a pretty good heavy on our team, so I was playing medic to keep him alive and boost his damage. I basically thought this was the best way to win the game. Some guy was playing pyro, and he would get pretty upset with me whenever he died. Now, I don't know how much you might know about the game, but medic is basically the only character that can heal other people on the team. There are health packs scattered around the map, and you can always go back to the base to heal. I was focusing on healing the heavy, but I wasn't neglecting the other players. The pyro kept rushing forward into the entire enemy team and was expecting me to follow and keep him alive, which I obviously wasn't going to do. It made me angry whenever he blamed me for his death or insulted my skills at the game. I did my best to ignore him and play the game. We ended up winning, and I felt good about it. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. When I logged off, I noticed I had a new friend request on Steam. It was the same pyro that was insulting me in-game. Now, I usually don't do this, but I was curious as to what he was going to say, so I accepted. At first, he did exactly what I expected. The chat box was instantly filled with all kinds of insults and threats. I wasn't bothered, but I didn't know what was happening in the background. I knew about viruses and that, but I always thought you had to click a link or something for that to happen. Turns out, all I had to do was accept his friend request. I went to close the chat, but my mouse wasn't working. Then, the cursor started moving all by itself. I watched in disbelief as the cursor on screen opened the browser and someone started typing something in. I didn't touch my keyboard or my mouse. The pyro had taken control of my computer somehow. Obviously, I didn't let it go any farther than that. I turned off my computer by holding the power button in, and that was it. I didn't get to see what the guy was going to search with my browser, and I really am not interested. My curiosity has limits. That incident kind of put me off TF2 completely. I still play other games, but I've never gone back to that one. Story number 4. For mine and my sister's safety, I won't be giving too many details in this story. I won't tell you the game I was playing or the gamer tag of the creep that might have ruined online gaming for me completely. At the time, we were sharing an apartment because neither of us could afford to live alone, and we were both too prideful to go back to living with our parents. We got along well, so it worked for us. When it came to gaming, we had completely different tastes, but there was this one online game that we both enjoyed. I don't want to risk giving too much away about the game, but I will say that you could eat food for health. We were in a squad with 2 other people we didn't know. One of them was pretty chatty, but the second guy didn't really say anything. After a while, my sister started joking about how the food in the game looked so good that it was making her hungry. She went on to say how she was craving pizza. That was normal for her, since she loved pizza. I agreed, and the other guy had a laugh about it. The fourth guy stayed quiet. Later into the night, we were still playing with the same squad. Then, in the middle of the match, we heard the doorbell ringing. We weren't expecting anyone, so we ignored it. I guess the guy heard the doorbell over the microphone because, after being silent the whole night, he suddenly spoke up. All he said was, "Aren't you going to answer that?" My sister and I shared a look, but we didn't really have a reason to suspect the guy of anything. Boy, were we wrong. I did answer the door, and you won't believe me, but it was a delivery guy with a pizza. I argued with him for a few minutes about how we didn't order anything and that I wasn't going to pay for it, but he insisted that it was paid for already. I did what any reasonable person would do and took the pizza. My sister didn't complain. We carried on playing while we ate, and that's when the silent guy spoke up again. This time, when we heard his voice, it sent shivers up and down our spines. He said, "How's the pizza?" We had turned our microphones off so they didn't have to hear us eating. I know he heard the doorbell ring, but he couldn't have possibly known that it was a pizza delivery guy at the door. Obviously, we both freaked out. After a short debate, we both left the game without saying anything. We didn't even finish the pizza. I felt sick to my stomach that whole night, and I even thought about calling the police, but what would they have done? We were on edge for a whole month after that, double-checking that the doors were locked and looking over our shoulders. There's no doubt in my mind that the silent guy had sent a pizza to our house. I don't know why, and I don't know how he knew where we lived. It's the not knowing that scares me the most. Story number 5. Escape from Tarkov isn't really a new game, but it's not old either. It's really expensive, which also makes it kind of exclusive. I guess that was initially why I was attracted to the game. There are a lot of gamers out there, so I wanted to feel special. After I bought the game, it was a hard ride. The game is extremely difficult, to the point of losing everything you have when your character dies and having to start the next game with nothing. The worst part is that it's online, so you could lose one game and load into the next with nothing, but someone else has a lot of really good gear. Anyway, I was determined to get good at it, and I eventually did. I was winning more than I was losing. I became one of those players with really good gear against people with nothing. The game became really rewarding for some time, and I never had any problems. I guess that's why what happened to me is still so frightening to this day. I got home after a long day at work, and I just wanted to play for a bit before heading to bed. I've never experienced hackers in the game or anything until that night. While I was playing, my game started glitching. My screen flickered, the sound cut out, and my character started doing all the things by himself. They were jumping up and down, spinning round in circles, and then firing up into the air until there was no more ammo in the gun. Now, at first I was worried because I'd gotten so much gear, and if someone heard the gunshots and killed me, I would lose all of it. I couldn't Alt F4 the game either. I just sat there and stared as the game went crazy. Then, something even weirder happened. The game doesn't have an in-game chat box, but one popped up at the bottom of my screen. And this is when I started shaking. The chat box filled in seconds with the same word, written over and over again. Die, 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 die. All in capital letters. It filled my screen in seconds and it didn't stop. I couldn't understand it, and it was starting to freak me out. I didn't care about my gear in the game anymore. I held in Alt F4 to shut down the game. That didn't work. Then my character just died, just like that. No one shot me. Nothing in the game happened that would cause my character to die, but they did. Then one final message popped into the game chat, and it still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. The last message was, "You're next." The screen went black and my computer shut down after that. That happened a few months ago and I haven't opened the game since. I don't know what to do. I'm so scared. Story number 1. I'm a doctor working in an extremely small town. Because the town is so small, our practice really only had 3 doctors. I was the only female working at the practice, so I usually dealt with all of the female patients. The other doctors were male, along with our one receptionist who also functioned as a nurse or assistant. I should say, I never really liked being the only female in the practice. I didn't really have anyone to talk to, and I couldn't make friends with any of my coworkers. I had plenty of friends outside of work, but I felt lonely whenever I was at the practice. Another reason I hated being the only female was how the others treated me. I'd walk into a room and they'd instantly fall silent after laughing and talking loudly with each other. They'd avoid me almost deliberately. They also always insisted that I never take on any of the male patients. On the day of this incident, both of the male doctors were late. I'd arrived early to catch up on some filing, and none of my patients were meant to arrive until late morning. I walked out into the waiting room to find a young boy sitting in one of the chairs. I asked the receptionist about it. He said the other doctors would be there in about an hour and that he had already told the boy to wait. I instantly thought this was a huge waste of time for the young boy. I was free and fully capable of seeing him. I told the receptionist that, and he reacted in a way that I didn't expect. His mood changed instantly. He insisted that the young boy wait and that I was only supposed to see female patients. Now, I was the doctor at the practice, so there was no way I was taking orders from the receptionist. I ignored him and told the young boy to follow me into my office. The receptionist instantly got on the phone behind me, and I heard him talking to one of the other doctors about it before I closed my door. I started off as usual. I asked the boy what was wrong while I put on my gloves and prepared my tools. It was something simple. He said his stomach was hurting. I figured it was either food poisoning or something similar. I asked him to hop onto the bed and turned around to fetch my stethoscope. By the time I'd turned back to the boy, he'd already removed all of his clothes and was standing in front of the bed with only his underwear on. As you can imagine, there were a lot of thoughts running through my mind in that moment. I was appalled, angered, confused, and most of all, I was worried. I didn't want to explode at the boy. He looked like he was only 14. I also wasn't about to trust him as far as I could throw him. I asked him what he was thinking and demanded that he put all of his clothes back on. He seemed just as confused as me. That was when he told me that whenever he saw the other doctors, they'd ask him to take off his clothes. A pit formed in the bottom of my stomach. I felt sick. A feeling of guilt for blaming the boy and thinking ill thoughts of him mixed in with my extreme anger and disgust towards my coworkers. Everything started clicking into place. I realized why I wasn't allowed to see any of the male patients. It horrified me to think about how long this had been going on. I locked my door and called the sheriff's office. It wasn't long before I heard my coworker slamming on my door, but thankfully the sheriff and his deputy arrived shortly after that. The police from the nearby city got involved, and I was called in for questioning. To this day, I'm still not entirely sure of the extent of the case, but I've heard that almost 40 young boys were physically abused and molested by the doctors. The receptionist was in on it all and helped them get away with it. It goes without saying that I don't live in that town or work at that practice anymore. Story number 2. When I was around 10 years old, I was diagnosed with a pretty serious disease. I won't go into details about it because it still confuses me to this day. All I'll say is it caused me to spend a lot of time in the hospital. I'd have to stay as long as a whole week. Because of this, I got really close to all the nurses and doctors that worked on or around me. This went on for years, and by the time I was 16, I had gotten used to it all. I saw the hospital as my second home, and everyone there was like my second family. It wasn't the life I would have preferred. It also wasn't a bad life. One night, I was having a lot of trouble sleeping. I'd been dealing with a lot more pain and discomfort than usual. I already called the nurse to up my dose of painkillers. I felt bad if I ended up calling her too often. I decided to deal with the pain for the night and just wait till morning. Sometime in the night, I thought I heard someone running down the hallway outside my room. It sounded strange. I woke up to the sound of bare feet pattering on the tiles. I sat up and watched the hallway for a bit. I was about to get out of bed when I saw something small and pale flash past my doorway. It made the same sound of bare feet running across the tiles. I instantly pulled my feet back into my bed. I wasn't sure what it was, but the sound was creeping me out. I stared at the doorway for what seemed like ages. Then I spotted eyes peering at me from the bottom of the doorway. A little boy was lying on the floor and peeking at me through the doorway. I almost screamed when I noticed him. His eyes were wide and sunken in. His skin was pale and his lips were blue. It was a cold night. My initial thought was of concern for the boy. I wanted to call for a nurse to take him back to bed before he got too cold. Then, at the back of my mind, a thought occurred to me that this wasn't a boy at all, but a ghostly apparition of one. I was 15, so thoughts like these were both common and also silly for me. I called to the boy. I asked what he was doing, or if he was okay. He let out a giggle and pulled away. The next thing I heard was his footsteps running back down the hallway and fading into the distance. Nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I asked the nurse if the children were allowed to move around the hospital at night. She said that they weren't, but that some of the more restless kids do manage to sneak past them. I didn't want to get anyone in trouble, so I didn't tell her about the boy that I saw. To this day, I'm still not sure if what I saw was a boy from the children's ward playing around, or if I actually witnessed a ghost of a boy who didn't make it. Story number 3. You might not believe this, but I hardly ever need to visit a doctor. I'm extremely healthy, and I've been complimented before on how strong my immune system is. I visited a doctor when I was a baby for general checkups and that, but after that I never really needed to go. One of the few times I went to a doctor's office really sticks out for me. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life. I didn't get sick or anything like that. I was messing around with my brothers. Since I wasn't just the youngest, but also the only girl, I was really trying to prove myself to them. Long story short, I fell off the roof, missed the pool, and broke my arm. At the time, we didn't know I had broken my arm. I was in a lot of pain, but my mother was convinced that it was just a bad sprain. She made an appointment and we went to the doctor the next day. Yeah, we won't talk about me having to deal with the pain of a broken arm for a whole day. Anyway, the majority of the doctor's visit went pretty normal. My mom was annoyed when the doctor insisted that my arm was broken. My mom demanded x-rays to make sure, and the doctor said they would have done that regardless. I was sitting in the x-ray room and the lady was positioning the machine by my arm. She retreated behind her shield, and I heard the loud hum when she turned on the machine. It wasn't long until I noticed her demeanor change. She was freaking out. She went into full-on panic mode, and I wasn't sure why. I watched her running around for a few minutes and pressing buttons. Then she left the room through the side door in her shielded area. She returned later with a doctor. I had to sit there and watch both of them panicking. At this point, I didn't know what to think. I thought there must be something seriously wrong with my arm. The longer I sat in that room, I started feeling really sick. I actually threw up. I think I passed out eventually because I woke up in a hospital bed with my mother crying her eyes out beside me. Now, I was unconscious for the entire experience, but the doctor explained it all to me when I woke up. The x-ray machine had malfunctioned. One of the tubes came loose and radiation was leaking into the room. The worst part was that they couldn't shut the machine off. I was exposed to a high level of radiation, which is why I felt so sick and passed out. They had me in an isolation unit for a while, but I was out for the whole experience. I suffered from a few side effects later, but I wasn't exposed enough for it to do any real long-term damage. I can't explain how terrified I was in that moment. My strong immune system didn't mean anything, and I could have easily died. Story number 4. I had a really bad childhood. This has nothing to do with my parents or the way they raised me. I was a problem child. I was constantly getting into trouble and wanting to run away. It got to the point when I was doing some really bad things. I was in a bad place mentally, and it was starting to show in some of the worst ways. I'm in a better place now, but it got so bad back then that my parents decided to send me into a mental hospital for a week. This was so that the doctors could assess me and find out exactly what was wrong. I can't really talk about my stay there since there isn't really anything to talk about. It sucked for the most part. I hated the food, I was bored out of my mind, and I found most of the people staying there with me either annoying or stupid. During my stay, my roommates started freaking out one day. They were a pretty chilled guy from what I can remember. He kept to himself and was really quiet. They say that you should never trust the quiet ones. I'm not sure what set him off, but he just started screaming at the wall. He was sitting up straight in his bed with his mouth wide open and just screaming at the top of his lungs. Obviously, the nurses rushed in straight away and subdued him. He didn't fight back or anything, he just kept screaming. That night I was laying awake in my bed, mostly because it was kind of hard to sleep when my roommate was groaning all the time. They had tied him to his bed and given him a sedative. It wore off in the middle of the night, and he was determined to keep me awake with him. I was just staring at him when he suddenly snapped his head to look at me. His eyes were wide, and he had the most dead serious expression in his face. He looked straight at me and said, "I'm going to kill you." I'll never forget that moment. I was frozen in terror. He was so serious about it that I could tell it wasn't a joke. He meant it. I was so glad that he was tied down to that bed. The next day, I told the nurses what happened, and they were just as shocked as me. They moved me to another room and made sure to keep my roommate tied to his bed for a little longer. Eventually, my week-long stay ended, and they diagnosed me with a mild form of bipolar disorder. My life changed from that point, and I got a lot better. I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes after having a nightmare of my roommate breaking through his restraints and coming to kill me. Story number 5. I want to start this story by stating that I don't think all doctors are bad. I just had a really bad experience with one. In fact, it was a nurse that ended up saving my life after the doctor made a horrible mistake that almost killed me. I should state that I am deathly allergic to this one chemical that is used in the majority of painkillers and sedatives. I don't want to get technical, and I'm not even sure how to spell the chemical. Whenever I have to go to the hospital or do anything that involves medicine, my mother usually writes down that I'm allergic to the chemical, and the healthcare professionals react accordingly. It makes their job really difficult, as they have to really think about the chemicals used in whatever medicine they give me. One day at school, I had a really bad migraine. I got them often, but this one was extremely bad to the point where I had started screaming during one of my classes. They kept me in the nurse's office until my mom arrived to take me to the doctor. My mother handled everything while I just sat there in pain. A nurse finally came to escort me to a doctor's room, and I sat there for another 5 minutes. The pain had subsided at this point, but it was still pretty bad. When the doctor finally arrived, my mother had gone out to get some coffee. I was completely alone, and only 10 at the time. The doctor looked both bothered and uninterested. I could tell his mind was elsewhere. He basically just glanced at my file and made his decision, which was that I was in a lot of pain, so he should obviously give me some pain medication. He told me he was going to give me a shot of something. I can't remember the name of the medicine now, but I recognized the name back then. I had come to recognize certain names of medicines that I wasn't allowed to take because of my allergy, and I knew that the doctor was about to give me that exact medicine. I protested his decision instantly, but he didn't listen. In his mind, I was just a little kid that decided to be difficult. He was in a hurry to get somewhere else, and he wasn't interested in anything I had to say. He tried to force the medicine on me, and that's when I started screaming for help. A nurse ran into the room demanding to know what was happening. The doctor tried to defend himself and say that I was being difficult. Then I told the nurse what medicine he was trying to give me. She lost it. She was there when my mother was filling in my file and explaining my allergy. She grabbed the syringe from the doctor and threw it across the room. She started yelling at him about reading my file and how he could have killed me. Then my mother came back into the room, and it only got worse from there. Long story short, we never saw that doctor again. I'm not even sure if he kept his job after that. I could have died in that room had it not been for the fact that I recognized the one name of a medicine that I couldn't take. Story number 1. I'll never forget the day my dad and I nearly died. Deer hunting is such a huge sport and so many people do it, you wouldn't think about how dangerous it is. The story I'm about to tell you is mostly vague in order to protect my father's identity, as he would rather not want the world to know who he is. You could say deer hunting as a sport runs in my family. My grandfather did it, and he taught my father to do it. My dad really wanted a son, but he got me. Still, he didn't let that stop him from teaching me how to hunt just like his dad taught him. I won't say whether I actually like hunting or not. I mostly enjoy spending time with my dad, and my knowledge in guns and wilderness survival is also popular with the guys. Long story short, the hunting season had just started, and we couldn't wait to get out there. My dad was so excited. It was shortly after my last year at school, so he was happy it was going to be the first season when I didn't have to study for a test or anything like that. So we packed the car for a full camping trip. It was our third day in the woods. We'd been tracking the herd for the past 2 days, and we were getting close. We didn't know yet that we were also being hunted. I remember my knees digging into the dirt and the brush of the undergrowth tickling the sides of my necks. I studied my breath, just like my dad taught me. The deer we were stalking was close, but I couldn't see them yet. I stayed back as my dad scanned the ground. Tracking was never my strength, so I left that to him. That's why we kind of got separated. I stayed in the undergrowth and he moved forward. At some point, he froze. This seemed strange to me because I knew we weren't that close to the herd. There was no reason for him to just freeze like that. His head slowly turned towards me, and the look of absolute terror on his face will always haunt me. His eyes were wide, his mouth was hung open, the bottom lip quivering, and his skin had gone as pale as snow. Before I knew what was happening, he yelled at me to run. I knew better than to argue or question him. I got to my feet and spun around so quickly that I actually twisted my ankle. I ended up limping away as fast as I could rather than running. I could hear my dad crying and screaming behind me. At the time, I had no idea what was happening, and the only thing I knew I should do was keep running. I made it back to our camp and scratched through our luggage for the spare radio. We were so deep in the forest that it was rare to get a signal, so I didn't even try my phone. I managed to get a hold of the park rangers nearby, and they sent help straight away. Basically, my dad realized a little too late that we were being hunted by a black bear. We didn't know it back then, but we had entered its territory on the second day. It caught our scent and stalked us the entire third day while we were tracking the deer herd. It's unusual for a herd to go through a bear's territory, but our presence could have scared them so much that they took the risk. My dad saved my life that day. The bear was stalking me while I was crouched in the underbrush. My dad saw the bear and yelled at me to run. When I ran, the bear chased me and my dad attacked it in order to get his attention off me. My dad survived, but he was severely injured, and I ended up visiting him in the hospital for the next few months. We still go hunting, but both our tactics have changed, and we're far more careful. The scariest part for me was not knowing what was going on. I was terrified, but I didn't even know what to be terrified of. I didn't know why I could hear my father screaming behind me, or why he told me to run. I just did what I was told and hoped for the best. Story number 2. Let me start this story out by stating that I spend a lot of time around animals. It's my job. I'm a zoo vet. I know a lot of people disapprove of zoos, and, to be honest, so do I. However, the zoo I work for is different. We mostly operate off individual investors, and we're not as public as other zoos. We protect injured or endangered animals. They are brought to us, I treat them, and we keep them until we're sure they are ready to be released back into the wild. Of course, we are open to the public since we do rely on the entrance fee for funding as well. It's because of a visitor to the zoo that I am able to tell this story. It was mostly a slow day, and I was treating one of the pythons that had just been delivered to our zoo. The poor thing was crossing a road when a car drove by. Thankfully, it wasn't as badly injured as the driver described. He'd simply hit the python's head, and I wasn't that worried about its recovery. Unfortunately for me, the python wasn't as out of it when he arrived at the zoo as I thought he would be. I turned around for a second. By the time I felt the python's body wrapping around my waist, it was far too late. A python doesn't move that fast when it's wrapping around its prey, but its grip is so strong that by the time it has you, there's almost no way you can get free. I don't remember much from the experience. I couldn't breathe. The grip around my waist tightened and my legs went numb. The corners of my eyes grew dark, and eventually my eyes closed. So from that point on, the python would attempt to swallow me whole, and by all means, it would have been able to. Luckily, the zoo had a visitor that day. He was looking for the zoo's vet because he was concerned about the way one of the apes was acting. He'd walked into my office just after I had passed out. He acted quickly, getting one of the zoo handlers involved, and the python was shot with a tranquilizer. I am forever grateful to that man. He saved my life. I don't blame the python for what happened, as I usually don't blame any animal for any attacks. It's in their nature. This is their world, and I would never hate or blame an animal for attacking me. I'm just glad that this attack didn't mean the end of me. Story number 3. I'm a very gentle person. I like simple things such as reading, driving along the coast, and even golfing in my spare time. A lot of my friends joke that I might be a 30-year-old man, but I act like I'm 60 and getting ready to retire. My lifestyle, while being what most people describe as boring, keeps me safe. I have never been injured or need to go to the doctor for anything more than a cold. Still, it doesn't matter how careful you are. Misfortune has a way of finding the most unfortunate. You know that rumor that there are usually crocodiles in the lakes at golf courses? Well, it's not just a rumor. The lake at my golf course actually had a crocodile hiding in it. This isn't a normal thing. It was during the rainy season, and the golf course is close to a river that is part of a nature reserve. The large amounts of rain basically turned the golf course into the perfect marshland for the crocodile, and it wandered over from the river into our lake. By the time it dried up and the golf course reopened, the crocodile had made the lake its home. However, I didn't know any of this that day, or else I certainly wouldn't have reached my whole arm into the water in order to retrieve my ball. I was splashing around, certain that I had seen the exact spot where my ball had plopped into the water. The next thing I saw was a long row of large white teeth burst out of the water. I never knew exactly how fast crocodiles were until that moment. In seconds, its jaws clamped shut on my arm, and it had pulled me into the water. Crocodiles like to kill their prey in one of two ways. They pull them down into the water to drown them, or, when on land, they go into a barrel roll to disorient them. I didn't know exactly what to do. I panicked. Water rushed into my lungs. I couldn't see anything, and there was a throbbing pain vibrating up and down my arm that made me want to scream. I reached out towards the crocodile. By sheer luck, I had found the monster's eyes and jabbed my thumb into it. I felt its jaw release my arm, and I immediately kicked back towards the surface. Adrenaline rushed through my veins. I didn't feel the full extent of the pain until a few hours later when I was in the back of the ambulance. I lost my arm that day. The ambulance took far too long to get to me, and the crocodile had buried its teeth too deep. When I reached the emergency room, my arm was hanging on by a thread. Still, I could have lost so much more that day if I wasn't as lucky. Story number 4. The thing I remembered the most about the day I was attacked by a shark is the smell. When we arrived at the beach that day, there was a horrible smell in the air. It was foul. The hairs in my nose stunk, and it brought tears to my eyes. If you think this was enough to turn me and my friends away, then you don't understand the call of the waves. I was surfing before I could even walk. Both my parents were passionate surfers and got me hooked on it as soon as they could. We lived pretty close to the beach, but the best surf spot was a little enclosed beach about a 2-hour drive away from our house. We called it our secret beach. A lot of other people knew about it, of course, but it was such a far-out drive that it was mostly empty whenever we got there. We would have the waves all to ourselves. That day was the first day I went to the secret beach without my parents. My little sister, a recent addition to our family, got sick often. They would often have to stay home to take care of her, but they would never stop me from making it down to the beach as often as I could. A couple of my friends joined me, but not a day goes by when I don't wish that at least one of my parents were there that day. Maybe they would have warned us. Perhaps one of them would have known that the foul smell in the air was a sign of a whale carcass nearby. They would have warned us that a whale carcass in the area would likely mean that the waters could be infested with sharks hell-bent on protecting their meal. They weren't there that day, and there was no one to warn me and my friends before we took our boards into the water. Obviously, we weren't out on the waves for very long before something happened. I was at the back lines, waiting for my turn to take a wave. My friend Josh had caught the first one, and my other friend Ted was next. I remember watching him when it happened. I always liked to see which waves my friend would deem worthy enough for a ride. In a flash of white ocean spray and blue, leathery skin, Ted vanished from my sight within a second. For a split second, the world froze. All I could hear was my heart pounding in my chest. The heartbeat echoed along with the muffled cries and screams from my friends. Josh was the first to rush into action. He paddled out to Ted's board. I watched him take off his ankle strap and dive into the water. I'm not sure if it was seconds or minutes that passed before he resurfaced, barely managing to hold Ted above the water. My brain had rebooted at that point, and I quickly paddled over to help. With the help of Oliver, the other guy on the waves with us that day, we got Ted back onto his board and helped pull him back to shore. We got him in the car and rushed him to the hospital. Ted was luckier that day than most. The shark that had attacked him hit the board, but missed Ted. He was knocked off the board and rendered unconscious, but he didn't suffer any other injuries or lose any limbs. We started calling him Lucky Ted after that, and Josh, well, he's the bravest man I've ever known. Story number 5. Killer whales have always fascinated me. For instance, the fact that their nickname is given to them purely because they kill whales, and not because they are actually whales, is the first piece of information about them that intrigued me. They're part of the dolphin family. I wanted to learn more about them, and that was when I decided to dedicate my life to killer whales. I knew how dangerous they were at the time this story takes place. They're nothing like their dolphin cousins. They don't play with you. They aren't cute and cuddly. They are deadly beasts. Still, I'd grown attached to one during my studies at the local aquarium. We called him Triton, and he'd already attacked 4 of his handlers. We were under the impression that he was more aggressive towards males than females, since out of the 6 handlers he's had, the 4 that he attacked were male and the other 2 were female. This gave me some confidence as his 7th handler, since I am female. I was wrong to have that kind of confidence, but what happened to me was a complete accident. I was feeding Triton his usual snack at the end of the day. The aquarium was closing, and we were mostly on skeleton staff. I accidentally dropped his food bucket while tipping the food over into the top of his tank. I knew I'd get in trouble if I just let the bucket float there because Triton liked to play with them, and he might even eat it and choke. I leaned over the tank. Triton was distracted by the waterfall of food floating to the bottom of his tank. The bucket floated away from me with every attempt I made to snatch it. I leaned over as far as I could. There was no way I was getting into the tank under any circumstances. I reached out one last time, slamming my hand down into the water in a botched attempt to grab the bucket. Not only did I swat it further away from me, but I lost my grip on the only thing holding me above the tank. The water enveloped me, and I was instantly blind and deaf. I fell in head first and quickly worked to turn myself around in the water so I could kick back to the surface. As I began kicking upwards, I felt something clamp around my leg. My eyes were still closed, so I couldn't see what was happening, but I had a pretty good guess. Triton had grabbed my leg in his mouth and was dragging me to the bottom of his tank. It was how he had killed his last 4 handlers. He was going to drown me just like he did them. I didn't fight back or attempt to escape. I knew there was no point. A killer whale is strong and fast, so there was no way I could escape his grip and swim back to the top of the tank before he grabbed me again. I knew I was dead. Then, Triton let go of my leg and left me floating motionless in the water. I wasn't sure what to do. He could have been playing a game with me. I didn't trust it. When I felt someone's arms wrap around mine from behind, I realized that some of the workers had leapt into the tank to save me. Triton didn't like groups and would always avoid multiple divers. The moment someone else hopped into the water, he left me alone. We had a skeleton crew at the time. I didn't expect anyone to jump in to save me. I certainly didn't expect it to be the janitor, John. I was certain that I was going to die that day, but my hero was brave enough to save me. I still love killer whales, but I'm a bit more cautious when I'm around Triton.